evening. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this session of George Talks Business. Today, our guest is Stephanie von Friedeburg, Senior Vice President of Operations at the International Finance Corporation. Thank you very much for being here. I know you're returning. It's so good to see you in person. Welcome to the show, Stephanie.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. So, Stephanie, we have received a lot of questions, and we will try to merge them into some of the topics that I would like to pursue. And there are quite a few different topics we want to talk to you about. But let's start with, you have spent a few years at IFC. So let's start a little bit about what does IFC do, and maybe a few details of your journey through the IFC.
Absolutely. So IFC, the International Finance Corporation, is the private sector development arm of the World Bank Group. So when people think about the World Bank Group, they think about one entity. It's actually 5 separate organizations that each do different things. And IFC was created in 1956 by a very limited number of our shareholders, led by the United States, who really believed that if we wanted to create good economic outcomes in our countries of operation, so the poorest countries in the world, you really needed the private sector, because that's how you get economic growth and jobs. And that was the genesis of IFC. And we actually started with $500 million of capital, and today we sit on over $30 billion of capital, pretty much earned over the course of the 65 years we've been in existence.
So a lot of good can be done with that much amount of money, hopefully.
Absolutely.
2 years ago, I remember when we were talking about this, that was a virtual session, unfortunately. We were talking about IFC's response to the COVID crisis. And in today's date, I don't know whether COVID is behind us or not, but certainly there is a war in Ukraine. There is an energy problem, hunger issues in the world. There is climate change that is on top of mind. There are just too many crises all together. I want to hear your thoughts on how they are impacting the global economy, and what are some of the things that you are seeing through the lens of the IFC all over the world.
Yeah, I've been in the IFC, I've been in the realm of development for 30 years. And for 30 years, we had global growth, we had global connectedness. The world is moving in the wrong direction. And for the first time, I'm actually very worried about development. David Malpass, who's our president, said at the United Nations earlier in the week that development is in crisis. And it's in crisis first because of COVID and the impacts that COVID has had on the global economy, probably hitting the poorest countries the hardest. And then you layer on top of that the war on Ukraine, which has brought massive food insecurity, and climate change, where the world's poorest people are being the most affected by natural disasters, floods, fires, famine. And all 3 of those things are colliding together in an atmosphere of geopolitics that are pulling the world apart, not together. So for 30 years, we brought global rates of people living in the poorest countries in the world down very consistently on a pretty even slope. Started to level out long about 2010, and now it's risen again. And each one of those crises has pushed more and more people into abject poverty. And we define abject poverty by anyone that lives on $1.90 a day or less.
Wow. So there are so many different aspects that you are covered here, and I want to peel each one of them a little bit and go a little bit deeper. Let's start with the impacts of the war in Ukraine. How is IFC adapting its approach to meet the current challenges, not just in Ukraine, but in other countries which have been indirectly or directly affected by this war?
Yeah, so first I have to tell you, truth be told, this is very near and dear to my heart. I actually have 2 degrees in Russian area studies, and I sat on the Ukrainian National Investment Council for many years. So I'm very, very close to Ukraine and very much pushing for us to engage more, not less. There's a couple of different crises unfolding in Ukraine. So first, the war itself, and you'll see the escalation that's taken place over the last couple of days because of the progress the Ukrainians have made, largely led by U.S. weaponry that's been provided and U.S. assistance. But Putin's pushing back, and now he's going to annex those, and he's going to try to pivot the war, which I think is going to make the fighting worse. So we've got complete destruction. We estimate that it's somewhere between $500 and $750 billion to rebuild Ukraine and to create a Ukraine of the future. $750 billion is a staggering sum of money. I actually went back. I'm a high commissioner on a CSIS council for Ukraine, and I just did some back-of-the-envelope numbers. If you look over the last 10 years, FDI has represented about little under 3% of the Ukrainian GDP, or $4 billion. So if we want FDI to help drive that, even if it's a third, which is what the world is asking, $250 billion, it'll take us 60 years to rebuild Ukraine. And it's not just infrastructure, but it's housing, it's education, it's the ability to bring people back who have left the country. And there has been an ongoing brain drain, but now it's worse than ever. And if you've relocated to Vienna or Warsaw, hard to take your children out of those environments and bring them back into a war-torn country. So a lot of really complex issues that need to be solved in Ukraine and then surrounding Ukraine. So one of the things we've been spending a lot of time on is how do we move grain out of the country. So it's a breadbasket. If you go back in history, Ukraine has been conquered even by the Romans and the Greeks because it is the Black Earth is a breadbasket of the world. If they no longer have access to the Black Sea, which is where the majority of the grain is actually exported, how do we move that grain? Can it be done by train? If so, all the train tracks have to be redone. Can we do it through barges down the Danube and out Romania? These are all possibilities, but very, very expensive and continuing to raise the cost of food for the world.
Wow, that's very impressive and very informative what you just said. I know we want to get to the climate change and other topics as well, but one of the things that we did not yet start talking about is the rising cost of energy and the access of energy, or the lack of access to energy. I know there are, the World Bank has published the Energy Progress Report. Could you give us a little bit of an idea about what that report is about and what are we doing in terms of especially how this energy crisis is hitting the developing countries?
It's a great question. And, it's been evolving, and it's been evolving really quickly as a result of the Ukraine war. So if you go back to January of pre-Ukraine war, everyone was saying that we will build renewable energy for the developing world, and assuming that Africa, where less than 4% of the GHG emissions globally come from, and if you exclude South Africa, it's a substantially smaller portion, right? We're going to give them renewable energy and they'll be able to build industrial bases. I think we knew that that was not the case and that gas would always be a critical stabilizer and fundamental pillar to make the leap to green hydrogen and ultimately be able to put renewable energy on top of that. I think we were an outlier in that, and most of our developed world shareholders were really pushing us very hard to focus on wind and solar and ultimately on some of the newer technologies around green hydrogen. We actually, against our charter, cannot invest in nuclear, so it's something we haven't contemplated. When the war on Ukraine hit, and I will never forget this, I was at a massive conference on climate, and they had all the climate czars there. And they all started to talk about energy security, not climate. So energy security has really shifted the mindset. And if you look at what's going to happen in Europe this winter with the inability to buy Russian gas, I personally think you're going to see more coal, you're going to see more gas, and there's going to be some leeway to allow Africa in particular to build large gas-fired power plants and potentially to develop some of their gas reserves that are offshore off the coast of Senegal in particular.
So I don't want to continue talking about challenges, but having you here, it's an educational experience for folks who are living here and perhaps not seeing it and thinking about some of these issues on a daily basis. But there is an accelerating global food shortage, for example. Can you give us the scope and impact of the food shortage in the world, especially as it's maybe affecting some of the developing countries?
Yeah. So again, if you think about Ukraine, it's 10% of the world's supply of wheat. And that's red wheat. A lot of that wheat goes to Northern Africa and into Asia where unleavened bread is typically used. Cutting off those supplies is going to create, and we know this statistically, the thing that generates more social unrest is food insecurity. It's not anything else. So as food becomes more complex to source and more expensive, we're going to see more and more insecurity. We're estimating that in Ukraine alone, less than 70% of the fields actually were replanted. And one of the issues that we've been grappling with is the mines. So we're still, we're still removing mines from Vietnam. We're still finding unexploded, things from World War II. Can you imagine the minefields that have been laid in the agricultural sector in Ukraine? So for more than 3 to 5 years, you're going to see a massive disruption in the capacity of the country to be able to export grains and oils like sunflower oil. Then add on top of that, the fundamental thing that actually has driven food globally and the growth of food production, that's fertilizer. And you need three elements. You need nitrogen, phosphate, and you need a lot of gas. And that gas, by and large, was coming from Russia. And if it wasn't from Russia, that fertilizer was actually being produced in Russia, and Putin's not letting it leave. So again, you're going to see fertilizer prices increasing. So the smallholder farmer, especially in Africa, are not going to be able to afford any fertilizer. Crop yields are going to fall. And as crop yields fall, we're going to see even more shortages, I think, in the medium term, and continued increased pressure on pricing of food.
Wow. So you had mentioned about the poverty and the aspects of that. And there is a question from one of our students, Neha, who has submitted a question about how the pandemic has changed IFC's efforts to fight poverty and to raise the standards of living. And she's asking, can you share some examples how IFC is responding to its lasting impacts?
So it's a tough question to answer because
it's a student question. I was always going to show you the easy ones.
It's a really great question, right? Because what we've seen is a slowdown in investment. We've seen it globally. I mean, the world economy is headed into recession. We know that anyway. But in emerging markets, there's been an outflow of foreign direct investment, not an inflow of investment. And even large domestic companies in emerging markets have put investments on hold. So they're preserving cash. Banks are preserving cash. So very limited investment is going into those economies, which means jobs aren't being created. And if jobs aren't being created, then we're going to have more and more young people who aren't going to be employed, right? Yeah. So that's the first question. So what are we doing there? On the education side, working with tertiary and universities to see can we build better skill sets to create better employment. We're doing a lot in digital and digital infrastructure because we do believe the future of the economy is going to be digitally driven. So try to build those bases in our countries of operation. A big effort on health and healthcare, because we actually saw the massive disparities, not just in the availability of vaccines, but PPE, hospital beds, hospitals, clinics. So we're doing a lot in that space, and you'll see us continue to invest there. The infrastructure sector has been hit hard. Our infrastructure business is off probably 65 or 70%. Very difficult. Where the biggest piece of our business is increasing is trade finance, because more and more banks are pulling away from trade finance. And as supply chains have been disrupted, we've found the need to step in and try to keep supply chains open and running. And our trade finance business has gone from about $5.5, $6 billion a year to $10 billion, and it just continues to grow.
Right. Wow. So we were talking earlier, Stephanie, about our capital markets program. That is a joint program with IFC and GW along with the Milken Institute. And actually, Mr. Mike Milken was here yesterday talking to some of the students in that program. And he raised the issue about, and we were talking about the climate change and aspects of that. And I know that you have had, as IFC, worked on some solar projects and would love to hear a little bit about how you scale them. And there is a question one of our alumni, Emma, is asking if you would be willing to share some IFC investment success stories with sustainable finance and ESG in particular in Africa.
Sure. So let's start with solar, because I think it's a great example.
Yeah.
Building a solar park is not easy. It requires a lot of regulation. It requires interconnect to the grid. So to build a grid-scale solar plant requires a lot of land. So what we've decided to do is to actually bring the best people and the best investors that we know globally to these markets, was to create something we called scaling solar. So we created template documents that the government agreed to. The government, if they use scaling solar, agrees to provide the land and the connection to the grid. And all of the documentation in terms of the power purchase agreement, so the long-term purchase agreement of the power coming off of the solar park, is all negotiated with very standard contracts. So when a scaling solar project comes out for bid, you might have 4 or 5 different companies bid. They know exactly what they're bidding on, which reduces risk. Again, uncertainty in these markets is probably the biggest risk. And does the government do something or veer in a different direction? So they know what they're bidding on. We did the first one in Zambia, and I think it was about 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. The most recent one we did was in Uzbekistan, where we got to 1.8 cents a kilowatt hour.
Wow.
So that has actually proven to be a really interesting and strong way to replicate solar. So now we're working on wind, scaling wind. And again, wind is a little bit more complex because you actually need, the wind tunnels and you need to know where they are, and you have to be able to get access to the land. But we're working on scaling wind. What we're finding now, however, which takes us back to the very beginning of our conversation, is there's a shortage of solar panels. There's a shortage of wind turbines, largely first driven by the disruptions that came about as a result of COVID. But with the Uyghur instances in China and the majority of the solar panels coming out of China and coming out of areas where critical components of those solar panels are actually produced by Uyghurs and potentially inappropriate labor practices. Mm-hmm. It's made it much more difficult for us to support solar projects. And some of our countries, key countries like the United States and Europe, are saying, should we really be investing in solar parks where the solar panels are coming from China? And the same with wind. 70% of the wind turbines in the world are produced in China. And does the West want to continue to support that expansion, knowing that those goods are coming out of China? So it's making it very complex for us to figure out how do you actually deliver renewable energy.
Yeah, I can imagine that, and with COVID and with the supply chains as they are right now, it's even more challenging to imagine some of that. Tell me a little bit about, if you look at the net zero economy and what will it take and how much it's going to cost to really have a global green economy?
Numbers vary, right, in terms of how much has to be invested in any given year, but somewhere between $2.5 and $3 trillion a year by 2050, year on year, to get us to a place where we're actually, at net zero. And my personal view is there's been a lot of pledges to net zero. So if you look at GFANZ and SMI, these big financial institutions primarily have made a commitment to net zero. They don't know how to get off the taxi rank. And I actually think we need financial institutions to green their balance sheets because they provide the majority of the finance anywhere in the world, in any country. We can push, but we're this big, right? But if Citibank commits to net zero, or if JP Morgan commits to net zero, it means their balance sheet, so every single project and company that they support has to be on the path to net zero. That's the really big shift. And can regulation drive that? I'm not sure, but I think taxation can. And I'll give you a really interesting example. The city of New York has said any company that has more than 100 employees that buys energy from Grid 17, which is the New York City grid, if they can't prove it's clean, we're going to tax them. Now, you can't put solar panels in New York City. It's too congested. You could never create the amount of energy from solar or wind that you would need to actually run the city. So JP Morgan did something super interesting. They're building a brand new building. They went to Brookfield, which owns, through one of their funds, a bunch of hydroelectric dams in northern New York. They're using blockchain, and they're buying energy units in upstate New York and pulling them into the Grid 17, and can actually prove, because it's blockchain, that this is where they came from and that they're clean, so they don't pay the tax. And I think those kinds of interesting structures are going to help drive what needs to happen.
So sometimes the stick does work better than the carrot there. So
it might, yeah.
So let's change topics a little bit and talk about technology and digital innovation. Can you talk about the ways in which IFC supports the digital innovation and globalization overall?
Yeah. So this is a topic that I love. I actually ran our telecom and tech business for a long time. And at that time, what we really thought was mobile mattered. So we chased the mobile all around the world. We started in Latin America, we went to Asia, we ended in Africa. We made a lot of money, we took a lot of equity positions. And as we did that, we began to realize that as you bring mobile, you also bring kind of a digital ecosystem and a digital infrastructure. And we began to see very interesting VC opportunities. So we created a venture capital business within IFC that has very successfully invested in companies that are building, digital economies of the future. And we will continue to do that. You'll continue to see that business grow. But I think what we didn't do for many years was kind of, once everybody got mobile, we said, oh, done and dusted, everybody has mobile. But what we realized was you need more than mobile. You need fixed broadband. You need, fiber wire in the ground so that everybody can have access to the internet. And again, if COVID showed us anything, there were 1.5 billion children out of school. At the height of COVID, 450 million of those children did not have access to the internet. So they couldn't be educated, and we know they won't go back.
So that brings me to two questions. First, you mentioned this IFC has a venture capital team, so you're investing in various things. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you choose the startups in which you're investing. And then you were talking about this inequity in the entrepreneurial ecosystem overall. Yeah. Would love to hear your views and thoughts on how to create a more inclusive entrepreneurial environment. And this is in particular, we are trying to do our share of trying to, through programs like Elevate, where we are working with the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing in DC to train some of the underrepresented overall entrepreneurs. We also have, as you probably already know, on Penn Avenue, this whole Penn West Equity and Innovation District, which is forming, which is very exciting to be an anchor school right there for it.
Yep.
So, and the important word there is also equity and innovation district, and it kind of lends itself for your comments on how would you create an inclusive entrepreneurial system.
So, this is an aside, but it's funny. When an IFC person talks to somebody at the World Bank, so a World Bank person who's actually lending money to governments about what equity is, it's like two ships passing in the night. Because equity for an IFC staff member who's an MBA means a share, right? Mm-hmm. Equity from the bank means making things equal. Mm-hmm. So it's something that we need to put together so that both equal the same thing. Okay, so let's talk about how do we think about venture capital? And our thinking on this has evolved over time. We originally started primarily investing in venture capital funds and then using the ability to invest alongside them in co-investments to learn the market. That was a very successful strategy and the one that we've continued on. But that really drove us to distribute our staff globally. So 75% of our staff aren't based here in DC. They're based in our countries of operation. And we started chasing unicorns. And the one thing that I thought was chasing unicorns is probably not the right thing to do. What we actually need to be able to do is start looking for patterns. So the Truck Alliance in China, which actually brought digital technologies to truckers so that they were actually being more efficient in their trucking routes, was an idea that we could replicate in Africa with Kobe 360. And as we started to do that kind of work, what we realized was actually technology is going to be embedded in everything that we do. So our technology teams are now squared off against our three pillars. So financial institutions, where we do a lot of digital financial services, our infrastructure services, where is digital going to change infrastructure? So think smart grids, metering, all of that kind of stuff. And then in manufacturing and services, where you can get into healthcare, you can get into agribusiness. One of my very favorite investments that we've done is with a company called Appeal. And Appeal is a company out of California that has developed a fully digestible vegetable coating for fruits and vegetables that extends its shelf life by as much as a month with no refrigeration. Wow. So we've helped them bring their technology to, avocado growers in Africa, to apple growers, in South America, and they can then bring those products into the U.S. So if you guys go to Whole Foods and you look for an Appeal label, you'll see it on the fruit in Whole Foods now.
Wow, that's interesting.
Very
cool.
Cool.
Learn every time I talk to you, I learn something new there, so this is great. But continuing on that equity part, I think, I don't know if there is enough investments going into startups which are owned by women. There is a huge gender gap. And some studies have estimated it'll take 132 years or so to close that gender gap. Your comments on that, and how can we be, I know there are some initiatives with the IFCs pursuing to address that gap. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's something that we've been laser focused on, women and women in development, because again, it's half of the world's population. If we leave them off the table, it's like reading War and Peace without the peace, right? So we need women at the table. So we started focusing first on how do we lend money to SMEs. And a lot of that work was actually done through typical banks, where we would give a credit line to a bank and they would on-lend to the SMEs because they could reach them, and then it would have a gender focus. But what we began to realize is that in some essences, there's 850 large banks in the world, and we've kind of saturated that market. So what's next? So embedded finance, which is digital financial services that are embedded in platforms. So think Toast. I don't know if you know what Toast is, but it's a really interesting platform that started in the United States to serve restaurant owners. And they handle your inventory, they handle your reservations, they handle your menu, and they can actually produce your balance sheet faster than you can produce your balance sheet. So that kind of embedded finance allows these platforms to use the data to then lend money. And we're starting to see really interesting opportunities to lend money. And what we've tried to do is provide credit lines to a company like Toast, for example. We're doing it with Wave in Africa is a very good example. But then we tag that, say this needs to be gender related. And then together with that, our technical advisory services team spend a lot of time building ecosystems within a country. So are there enough incubators that are serving women? For a really interesting program with an incubator out of the Middle East called Flat Lab 6, which has moved into Northern Africa. And we've made credit lines available to them to support women-only led businesses that are technology-driven, because we actually think it works. And if you have time, you should go on our website and pull the report that we did on e-commerce in Africa. And it's fascinating. There are more women-owned companies in e-commerce in Africa than there are men. But the women's companies tend to be smaller and less aggressive because the men are more assertive in terms of saying, I'm going to advertise, I'm going to borrow money to advertise, I'm going to grow my business. And the women are much more conservative. So understanding behavioral patterns that differ between men and women and how do you grow a woman's business is really important.
Wow. This is very inspiring. Congratulations on that. But I know we are going to run short of time. It always happens with you here. But I do want to plant in one or two more questions, if I may, because some of the students have submitted. And it's a little more personal. Faith, one of our students, is asking if you have faced any challenges as a woman in leadership roles on a global world international stage. And if so, how have you handled that?
So I have never considered it a glass ceiling. I've considered it a cement ceiling in many occasions. And I have encountered very difficult challenges as a woman. So when I was a young investment officer, one of my mentors, who's still my mentor today, said to me, you know, Stephanie, as you mature, you need to learn the art of war. And he gave me a copy of The Art of War and said, you need to stop fighting battles, you need to win the war. So it was really about thinking more strategically about when to be more feminine and when to be less feminine, and how do you actually find that right balance. When I took over our telecom team, I was in Barcelona, which is where the GSM has their global conference, and they bring all the CEOs from their organization together into one meeting. There's about 350 people in that meeting. I had a personal invitation. I was the only woman in the room, and when I walked in, the first thing somebody asked, whose secretary are you? It's like, no, I have a seat in this table, right? So some of it has to do with, and I think this is important advice for all the women in the room. When a woman gets a job, she says to herself, I only have 75% of the skills to be successful in this job, and she sits at the edge of her chair. A man gets the same job, and he has 30% of the skills to be successful, and he sits back in the chair and says, boy, this is comfortable. I deserve to be here. So for every single woman in this room, know that you got that chair because you deserve it. Lean into it and enjoy it.
Great advice. Especially since I have two daughters, I think I'll share that advice with them as well. So let me ask you one final question before we close the session today. Connected to that, there are a lot of students who are interested in human capital development. So from your lens on the global stage here, what are the skill sets of the economy for the future? What should they be looking at?
So human capital is critical. And I actually read a statistic today that said that in the United States, more than 60% of our GDP comes from human capital. In the developing world, it's more like 25 or 30%. So in terms of wearing the development hat, we have a long way to go on human capital. I personally believe, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, that generalists are going to become more important than specialists. And one of the things that I would encourage all of you to decide is that if you want to be a leader of the future, think about how do I learn a lot across so that you can connect dots and have a more strategic view when you're on the bridge. Because I think what happens today, or what's happened in the past, is people have gone vertical and they've gone very deep. And we appreciated that ability to go deep for many, many years. But the world requires different thinking. It requires working horizontally across those different verticals. And so I think leaders of the future really need to think about, how do I become more of a generalist? And how do I always continue to learn?
Excellent pointers. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for joining. It's
fun.
always a pleasure talking to you. It's so informative and fantastic conversation. And thank you all for joining us today as well. I also want to thank all of those who have joined us virtually as well. And next week, I will be joined by Elliott School Dean Alyssa Ayers for a conversation with Doreen Shahnaz, founder of Impact Investment Exchange and Impact Investment Exchange Foundation. I look forward to this conversation as well and hope to see you there. Thank you and good night.
That was fun.